This is Common Sense Radio. Straightforward and no excuses.
All right. Come on now.
This is the Steve Gruber Show.
Call me crazy.
Oh, yeah.
What I said was perfectly right and spot on accurate.
Boy's got a mouth like a cannon, always shooting it all.
Stop. Yeah, stop. I mean, you're way off script.
Got it in me. Gonna quit until it all comes out.
Hey, boy!
Been a long education.
Yeah, you know, it's not cynical. It's common sense.
Pay attention to me when I'm talking to you.
I'm gonna rock the nation. Rock the nation.
Genuine, accountable, and raw. Here is Steve Gruber.
It's Thursday. Welcome to the program. We have so much to talk about today. Big show ahead of us today. Dan Stein, the president for immigration reform, will be here to talk about a thoughtless immigration policy he says he's changed. We'll have Congressman Tim Walberg on the program. We'll have Joe Castleberry here to talk about this battle between DraftKings and FanDuel and using insider information back and forth. New policies from both companies banning their employees from gambling on the fantasy sports leagues. We'll keep an eye on that. Plus, a potentially game-changing discovery. Israel might be sitting on a pile of oil bigger than, well, you ever would have believed. A pile. After Israel complained for years that it was surrounded by oil-rich states but didn't have a drop within its own borders, it appears there is a big turnaround with an announcement yesterday that massive oil reserves have been located under the Golan Heights. We'll talk about that. In fact, we're going to talk a lot about energy here today. But first, we're going to talk about some IT issues. Hillary Clinton. Man, has it gotten sticky now. A Connecticut company, which backed up Hillary Clinton's emails at the request of the Colorado company that ran her ill-advised, potentially illegal server, has apparently surprised her aides because the emails were stored on a cloud storage system designed to optimize data recovery. The firm Datto said yesterday that it turned over all of the contents of its storage to the FBI the day before, so Tuesday, this week. A Republican Senate chair, Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson, also has asked the firm to provide the committee copies of any data from Clinton's accounts still in its possession. There were conflicting accounts as to whether the developments could lead to retrieval of any of Clinton's more than 31,000 personal emails. It seems that there's a good possibility now for sure that all of those emails they thought were, lost and therefore out of reach. Well, we'll find out. Congressional Republicans have voiced skepticism as to whether the nearly 31,000 emails that the Democratic presidential candidate handed over represented all of those related to her position as Secretary of State. And Clinton assured everybody that her lawyers carefully went through them. It doesn't matter anymore. The FBI also raided the State Department yesterday. So they raided Datto on Tuesday and the State Department yesterday. They took 5 computers out of the State Department. Let me assure you, when the FBI shows up at State and starts filling up vans full of what we like to call evidence, it's not a good day for you or your campaign. The FBI requested the contents of Datto's storage systems back on September the 10th. This past Friday, Clinton's attorney David Kendall and Platte River agreed to allow Datto to turn over the data from the backup server to the FBI, said a person who remains anonymous close to the investigation. Platte River will also be giving the FBI backup devices it purchased from Datto. Michael Fast, Datto's general counsel, said in a statement that with the consent of our client and their end user and consistent with our policies regarding data privacy, Datto is working with the FBI to provide data in conjunction with its investigation. He said clearly that data had no role in monitoring the content or source of the data stored by Platte River. You see what's going on here now? These companies, they're not going to roll over and die at the behest of Hillary Clinton. No, they're not. They're going to say, wait a second. All we did was this. Here's what you need. You're the FBI. Make yourself at home. Make yourself at home. Meanwhile, Hillary Clinton has changed her position completely on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, saying she does not support it now. Yet previously, as Secretary of State, she called it the gold standard in trade agreements. In her book, Hard Choices, released in 2014, Clinton lauded the deal, saying it would link markets throughout Asia and the Americas, lowering trade barriers while raising standards on labor, the environment, and intellectual property. She even said it was important for American workers who would benefit from competing on a more level playing field. She also called it a strategic initiative that would strengthen the position of the United States in Asia. You know, she walked away from NAFTA just in time to get elected to the United States Senate in New York in the year 2000, and now she's trying to walk away from this. Martin O'Malley taking issue with it. Of course, it'll be something for the discussion next week, because next week is the first Democratic debate. I believe that we will have Joe Biden in the race before we get to that debate. We'll keep an eye on that. Here's something for you, and before we get into, because I've got some discussions of energy, what Jerry Brown did in California ought to be rewarded with a jail cell, not with anything else. Jerry Brown may have just signed California's death warrant. We'll get to that after the break, and first this. This whole transgender craze taking the nation by storm is the latest sexually confused fad to run amok culturally and politically, and liberal politicians have wasted no time jumping on the bandwagon, using the momentum this issue generates to gather more fans of the Democratic Party. LGBT fanatics have worked tirelessly to create either gender-neutral bathrooms to accommodate cross-dressers. That's what they are. Because you put on a wig and a skirt doesn't make you a woman, just for the record. Or have even gone so far as to force schools and other establishments to allow those identifying as the opposite sex to use the bathroom of the sex they claim to be, or wish to be, or fantasize about being, or whatever you call it. Those that use a little something we call simple logic or an ounce of morality have spoken out against this madness, saying that it puts people in danger. We've talked about it right here on the program, particularly women and children who could be taken advantage of by folks who say they are transgender but are really gaining access to these restrooms. Of course, the left, as you might imagine, scoffed, mocked, and has ridiculed me and others for such claims, saying that just wouldn't happen. But guess what? It has. The University of Toronto has decreased the number of gender-neutral bathrooms in one of its colleges after 2 women became victims of voyeurism, peeping toms. They were filmed while showering. What a surprise. Transgender locker rooms and restrooms, a really bad idea. That's the University of Toronto, not exactly a bastion of conservative thought.
Genuine Michigan common sense on display every day.
It's Thursday. You're going to need a pencil because we've got some learning to do. Class now in session. California Governor Jerry Brown has signed a bill that he says will combat climate change, and he has mandated an increase in California's use of renewable energy, electricity, to 50%, and doubling energy efficiency in existing buildings by 2030, both of which are unattainable, I can assure you, in the next 15 years. Brown may have just signed California's death warrant. Let's hear from Jerry Brown a little bit.
Smog was invented in Los Angeles. It was invented. The name was invented. There was a fellow at Caltech, and he came up with the idea, and they called it smog. And so because of how bad it was, California became sensitive to air pollution and created the Air Resources Board, Ronald Reagan was governor. Richard Nixon was president. He signed the Clean Air Act. That was a time when Republicans really got it. We hope they're going to come back to the good old days of Reagan and Nixon, where people cared about clean air. Climate change.
Now, see, the problem is that you go too far. And, Governor, I'll get back to you, but right now you need to go smoke some of that fine California weed, because that's where Jerry Brown belongs. He's a hippie. He has no clue what's going on. You see, green energy, this renewable energy will never work, and that is a mathematical certainty. The sad truth is each and every one of your green energy supporting politicians know it as well, and they either don't care or they are more than willing to lie when looking you straight in the eye. In Michigan, for example, forget Governor Brown. In Michigan, for example, a new windmill costs about $5 million, and that's before it actually is installed. When it is installed, it's significantly more money. It can run about 380 homes. That, of course, is if the turbine is actually working, actually turning, which is only about 20% of the time. That's right, 20%. We've done our homework here, so you didn't have to. So what do those homeowners do the rest of the time, or about 80% of their day? No one really has an answer for that, but don't worry, it gets worse. The only way to get sustainable energy resources are actually financially sustainable is with your money and a whole lot of it. You see, it doesn't work without your tax dollars. I mean, lots and lots of your money. Without taxpayers getting blindsided and totally screwed by politicians that are either ignorant or corrupt, and there really is no middle ground here, the windmill fantasy wheel would have come to a screaming, screeching halt long ago. But you see, there are those among us who truly believe capitalism is the problem, destroying the world despite overwhelming empirical evidence that free trade and free markets are the single biggest factor in lifting human beings out of poverty and giving them real hope year after year. Liberty, which, simply put, is allowing the human spirit to soar without limitations, is the greatest motivating factor in the history of mankind. Letting human potential develop without the oppressive restraints of government and man-made limitations will always be the greatest economic engine we can harness in this world. Freedom creates freedom. It is a cycle of creation like nothing else. Free will creates free societies and free nations. Restricting people's freedom and liberty is the greatest threat to mankind in the coming decades and centuries. Yet, there are those among us like Jerry Brown that just don't accept these principles. There are those among us that blame America for just about everything wrong in the world and shriek that we use too much, build too much, and make too damn much money. They think that we know better. They think that they know better, actually, and they should be in charge of the means of production without exception, starting with energy. You see, there are those among us that refuse to understand and accept that socialism is the greatest failure of government in the history of the world. It almost without fail leads to dictatorship and tyranny and oppression. It doesn't matter to them. It doesn't matter what you tell them. The pure and unadulterated arrogance of the left is enough to make grown men gag. They really believe they are smarter than you. They believe that if they dictate how much water you flush in your toilet, what kind of light bulb you use in your home, and they demand that we use solar panels, windmills, and gerbil wheels to power the planet in the modern age, somehow it makes them intellectually superior. The truth is they are on a fool's errand. Socialism forcefully applied to the masses under the guise of green energy will be another failed social experiment. This one, however, could topple the United States from the position of leader of the free world to just another member of the third world. You see, America runs on vast quantities of cheap energy, which, by the way, we have in abundance like no other place on earth. Natural resources in America, this America, my America, not the pretend America that includes Honduras, Venezuela, and anything south of the Rio Grande. This America has more abundant natural resources than any place on earth. We are blessed from sea to shining sea with timber for houses, fields for crops, water for everybody, oil for power, coal for heat, and gas to cook, just to name a few. And we cannot sit idly by while the Marxists like Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Bernie Sanders scare the daylights out of the dimwits drooling on their smartphones from dusk till dawn. We may live in an age of great advancement, but we live in an ever-growing population of, how shall I say it, total effing idiots. If more than 10% of the population could do basic math, they could actually understand and figure out that windmills with, and I'm being generous here, with a 20-year life expectancy will never recover the $5 million purchase price. We're being drained and called into a crisis that does not exist because there are not enough people walking around today that can actually figure out that powering 380 homes about 20% of the time at a cost of $5 million plus installation over 20 years, has exactly no chance in hell of ever working. If more than 10% of the population could actually read and retain important information and do a little something I like to call critical thinking, we'd really be onto something. But that is a bit optimistic based on what I've seen at the mall lately. I am disgusted by the abject and willful ignorance of the sheep I walk among each day on the planet. That's the truth. But I am dedicated to doing my level best to raise awareness where I can, and you have my word on that. Over the past few weeks, I've come to find out some of these things. I'm going to share them with you here because I have a new source that works at one of the major utilities in Michigan, who has run these numbers, who has seen the studies, who has seen actual corruption, the actual manipulation of numbers to make you think something is one thing when it's truly another way. Oh, yeah, I'm going to share all of this with you in the weeks to come. Fact of the matter is it doesn't work, folks. They're fleecing you and I. And for what agenda? That's the real question. Steve Gruber Show. We'll be right back.
Delivering Michigan common sense with a big dose of truth and honesty.
I wanna fly like an eagle to the sea. Fly like an
888-900-9966 is the hotline number here to the Steve Gruber Show. We encourage your participation. The only requirement is a little bit of common sense. That's pretty much it. That's all I encourage. Common sense. 888-900-9966. You can also check it out at stevegruber.com, where you can find a listen live button so you can take us to work. And podcasts are right there as well, plus a place for you to post your comments. Send me a note and let me know what you're thinking. And we sort through those on a daily basis, so you can, maybe if your comments are also full of common sense, they'll make the program here. New research emerging now that shows the world's oceans are cooling the planet by emitting vast amounts of volatile organic compounds, VOCs, into the atmosphere. These VOCs are not presently accounted for by climate models and may explain in part or in whole the growing gap between the temperatures predicted by the models and those actually measured by satellites, called the pause. 18 years now that the planet has shown no propensity towards warming. Yeah, no propensity toward warming. And I just watched the president of the Sierra Club say that he thought that the pause referred to a period of time in the 1940s. Glad to know the Sierra Club is on top of things. Our next guest, H. Sterling Burnett, Ph.D., Research Fellow and Managing Editor, ECN Heartland Institute. Doctor, welcome to the program again.
Good to be on.
It's always interesting to me that that when presented with facts, scientific facts, and boatloads of it, it is the reaction of the Sierra Club and others who I've watched it do this, that they rely on the Union of Concerned Scientists and others. 97% of the people believe that this is the truth, and it's settled science. How settled is this science, sir?
Well, your opening sort of says it all, doesn't it? Here is this is just one example of the unsettled nature of the science. That in fact, if you look at the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN's climate body, the one that makes official pronouncements every year or so, even they say the science is unsettled. They tell you that there are like 7 different factors, and they're finding more factors all the time, but they acknowledge 7 different factors that affect climate and temperature. And if you look at what they say about how much they know about each factor, only 2 of the factors do they know very much about. That tells me that the other 5 are unsettled, that they just don't know much about them. And, of course, the one that they know the most about is CO2, the only one they ever study.
And yes, now we've had a mathematician, a PhD from Stanford, Dr. David Evans, who used to work for Australia's Department Interior, looking at global warming. who in 2005 and 6 said there's an anomaly, there's a problem with your formula, it doesn't work. So here's a man with 6 degrees, including a doctorate from Stanford, who now apparently, according to the left, is one of the dumbest people on the planet. It's interesting to me that these PhDs and doctorates, once they say, now wait a second, this doesn't work, and they look at it, and trust me, every one of you folks who has a PhD behind your name is a little brighter than I am as a general rule. And I respect people that have earned that title, and then they get mocked and made fun of. It's startling. It's almost juvenile in the way that they attack these people, and I'm sure you get a lot of the same.
Oh, well, I get all sorts of things. My PhD, to be fair, I'm not an environmental scientist or climatologist. I'm an environmental ethicist, but I had a lot of scientific and economic training in my background in statistics, and I can read the science. I don't go out and do the original research. And what you were opening with about the oceans putting out these volatile organic compounds, it's called isoprene, the particular one they're putting out. I can read that, and it has to factor in. What they show, what we know about volatile organic compounds is that they go up into the atmosphere and they block sunlight, cooling the earth. And the climate models account for about 1.5 billion tons of VOCs put out by the oceans. This is put out by dead organic matter, by fish that die, and by living organic matter like seaweed and stuff. Okay, that's 1.7 billion tons, and the models figured this in. But what these guys have found is that there's a thin layer at the top of the ocean. It's inorganic. It's just the sun working on chemicals in a thin layer on top of the ocean that puts out 3.5 billion tons of volatile organic compounds that the climate models don't figure in. Almost.
So it's not even included in the model.
Not even included.
Or any of the well, and let's be honest, the models are wrong. It's become pretty evident that there's been some fiddling with the numbers, but even fiddling with the numbers, let's just take it down to something very basic that we've talked about here on the program just recently. If you have hot, moist atmosphere, you end up with unstable atmosphere. You end up with storms, frankly. Interestingly enough, 2014 on the planet was the quietest year since they began keeping really good records in 1950. The least amount of tornadoes ever recorded was 2014. It looks like 2015, we might actually have less. There hasn't been a major hurricane to come onto Florida or the East Coast in a decade. Well, Superstorm Sandy, but Florida hasn't been touched in a decade. And the storm that just went by, it might be one of the only severe storms of the year. The incident of hurricanes and tornadoes has dropped dramatically over the last several years. That would indicate to me not an increasing in temperature and volatility in the atmosphere, but frankly just the opposite. That's what you learn in 5th grade science, for God's sake.
Yeah, and there you go. It's just another thing that the models get wrong. They get temperature wrong, and you pointed this out. Every year, the gap between what the models predict temperature should be and what the temperature actually measured, not just by satellites, but also by weather balloons put up 4 times a day around the world, and even by the surface temperature. If you look at the data from the surface temperature, before they start filling with and adjusting it, it's not showing warming. Well, the models predict more frequent and, more importantly, more powerful hurricanes. That hurricanes should be getting more severe, and yet we haven't had a major hurricane landfall in a decade. And
there hasn't been an F5 tornado. An F5 is something else for you.
It didn't landfall.
Well, I know, I understand that, which it veered away, which is unusual. The worst decade this in the last 100 years for hurricanes was the 1950s, and by far the worst decade for tornadoes was the 1970s. We haven't even had an F5 tornado in America in 3 years. Not one at all. I mean, and a handful of F4s. There's been no serious weather activity, and they always want extreme weather on the TV. Extreme weather, and hide and run for your life. It's nonsense.
Yeah. Well, you're right. It's like the 1950s, a decade when it was cooling, is when we had the highest number of hurricanes landfall. President Obama will be the first president to not have a major hurricane landfall. should he get through 2016. Since I think it's Zachary Taylor, it's somebody like that.
That's a long time ago. That would be the
Taylor.
that'd be the 12th president of the United States. Anyhow, that's just a little side note for you, Doctor. I appreciate your time. Always interesting. Look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks for having me on. Take care.
H. Sterling Burnett, Ph.D. from the Heartland Institute.
Michigan, born and raised with Midwestern values and Michigan common sense.
All right, welcome back, knuckle draggers, deniers, you four folks in the dark. Yeah. I mean, just the amount of insults that are hurled at us, because if you don't agree with the agenda on the left, there's something, inherently wrong with you. You're just not up to par. Well, at least that's what they try to tell us. It's the Steve Gruber Show on a Thursday. The phone number here to the hotline, 888-900-9966. I'm running the resistance for today. Dan Stein is the president for American Immigration Reform. It's been 50 years since it was all changed by Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas, the immigration policy of this country. And it has changed dramatically. And many would say not for the better. What does Dan Stein say? Let's find out. Dan, welcome to the program.
How are you? Good to be here.
So, as some people put it, thoughtless immigration policy, a failed policy, and by a lot of empirical evidence, that seems pretty obvious.
Excellent time to talk about the Hart-Celler 1965 immigration amendments. They were part of the Great Society program laws, which, as we all now know, set in motion things which have been difficult to manage and initiate regulations that are hard to control, as well as public spending. And in the case of immigration rates. The original sponsors of the bill, this whole scheme was was hatched out of a couple of organizations that were working to, who were upset that after World War II, displaced persons weren't reunified, and others who felt that in 1921, relatives of the Irish and Italian immigrants had been wrongfully denied because of the national origins quota system. So the 65 Act was supposed to fix those wrongs. And the sponsors, it was posthumously moved, of course, because of John Kennedy's assassination by the Johnson administration. And the folks who were promising to Congress what it would do were making estimates of the numbers who would come in as basically very small numbers. That all it was really doing was changing the mix overall to provide some basic fairness so that people from all over the world might have a shot at coming here. But instead, what it's done is basically say that people from all over the world should come here because it set in motion a system of chain immigration, like an old chain letter, where now every time an alien gets a green card or becomes a citizen, he or she gets a right to bring in additional relatives. And naturally, that means that every wave of immigration, it's not even a wave, but every year we have more immigration, we get more people waiting in line to come in. And it's impossible to control. And as a result, people come without regard to their income-earning ability, whether they speak English, whether they actually have productive potential. A small percentage come because they have needed job skills, but the vast majority come because of good old-fashioned nepotism, and now we can't get it back under control.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, as we look at these, the problems we're facing here, and we try to overcome this, it's all this talk about comprehensive immigration reform. But isn't that just code speak to codify and allow 12 million people to stay here illegally? I mean, we went through this once before with Ronald Reagan. We're going through it again now, and it doesn't seem to cure itself. In fact, it seems to be problematic and get worse. By 2050, we'll have 75 million people in America that don't speak English. That's not Teddy Roosevelt's design on how to, and Teddy Roosevelt embraced immigration, but he said, come here, assimilate, learn the language, contribute to what we're doing and building here, or go home. Now, Teddy Roosevelt today would be called some sort of a horrible human being and run out of town on a rail.
Well, Ronald Reagan probably couldn't get elected in California today because what you're having is a demographic transformation that's being engineered now by really by the Democrat Party. I mean, let's face it, there was historically a strong component of organized labor in the Democratic Party through most of the 20th century, and they were very much in favor of strong immigration controls. But when organized labor collapsed as a force in this society in the 1980s to 1990s, during the Clinton administration, there was this shift to start to look at immigration as the only way the Democrats could maintain political power, because the baby boomers were aging and our general social index was an aging society. People tend to move more conservative. They get more life experience. So they started to look at immigration as just a way to enfranchise the party. And now, with Obama, it's gone way off the cliff, totally off the cliff. The ethnic changes that are being brought about through the 65 Act are driving this so-called hard-left multiculturalist agenda, which, of course, is just another word for psychobabble. But the divisions and polarity we see now emerging between the two parties are between the old stock and the new stock, the pre-1970, post-1970, stock of the society. And, look, Adam Smith, most of human history, we've been talking about, despots and potentates and tribal leaders taking over by force. The notions of Adam Smith and free market economics, this idea that if you have a system of government that lets a human being pursue his or her own destiny and use his or her productive potential and power to the maximum, that the greater public good, the aggregate public good, is achieved. That was a revolutionary concept, and its expression through democratic Republican governance is what the American experiment is all about. But if you have one political party that is being driven by this big government quasi-socialist agenda, then
it's not quasi-socialism. It is socialism.
To these new immigrant voters who vote 7-1 very heavily Democrat and 10-1 Democrat, and the Republican Party is basically saying we can either sound more like Democrats, or we got to figure something else out. How about controlling immigration? Might be a good start.
Yeah, closing the door might be a good start in controlling what we're doing here. You can only have, you can't bring everybody. You can't bring everybody. That's
there's only so much time. There's only so much time before the country will irrevocably shift in a very pronounced way to the left.
That's right. That might have already happened. Dan Stein, I appreciate your time. We'll talk again soon, my friend.
Thank you, sir.
There you have it. Dan Stein, President for Immigration Reform, right here on The Steve Gruber Show.